The U.S. is going in a very interesting position. Of course, Trump has stated that the U.S. will impose tariffs on aluminum and steel on EU partners, Canada and Mexico, which puts him in, I think, a somewhat precarious position, and maybe certainly some of the Americans' European counterparts an advantage when it comes to negotiations this time around. So I think maybe more so than some other G7 summits, this is one that everyone will be watching quite carefully because at the moment it's also not entirely clear where the chips will fall or what the outcome will be. So we're very much in the eye of the storm, as it were, at the moment.
Yes, it will be very interesting. I mean, I ask myself, these guys, I imagine that behind closed doors, there's going to be a lot of discussion, a lot of heated discussions between these nations and, of course, against and with Trump.
Absolutely. President Trump. And one of the issues that I think is also a little bit of the elephant in the room, in a way, is also China and sort of the role that China is playing in some of these trade negotiations. Because one thing that I think is worth bearing in mind also is that now that Trump has perhaps upset some of his European partners, that opens the door a little bit for China. So China is sort of this entity on the sidelines that's also watching quite carefully. So the negotiations are obviously bilateral as well, but are playing out on a much larger stage.
And are the dynamics such that when Trump goes against China, so to speak, China runs to Europe?
In a sense, that's actually what we've seen happening. And many of these tariffs are actually, some would say, a gift to the Chinese. Just a few days ago, German officials were meeting with their Chinese counterparts to discuss further investment, to discuss trade, not only in Germany. China is Germany's largest trade partner, not only in Germany, but in Europe more broadly as part of the Belt and Road Initiative and also other projects that China is investing in throughout the continent. So there's definitely that aspect going on as well.
So what is the bigger risk? I mean, so your colleagues at the Atlantic Council said 4 out of the 5 geopolitical risks, greater ones, in 2018 are related to President Trump.
Sure.
How big a threat is he really? Or is a lot of this just politics?
I think that the concern with President Trump across many of the risks that my colleagues at the Atlantic Council highlight is that at the moment it's difficult to find coherence in much of his policies. So he's kind of the wild card, as it were. And as you see on China, for instance, with the ZTE, the ban on ZTE that was imposed back in April, and then he's backpedaled saying, well, if ZTE pays a fine or if there's some shakeup in the management of ZTE, the U.S. will soften that position. So there's a lot of back and forth, not just on China, on Iran, on other very important policy issues. So the concern around the Trump administration is that lack of clarity and cohesion, which I think is what's sending off alarm bells globally.
And in Europe specifically.
And in Europe specifically. I mean, the U.S. and Europe have, I think, shared global interests, especially in this wider context of a stronger China, of dynamics in the Middle East and elsewhere. So it behooves the U.S. to work closely with its European partners and not to isolate them or put them on the sidelines, as the U.S. has a little bit at the moment. So the G7 will have to, I think, repair some of that damage that has been done going forward, especially for the long term.
But is that possible in 2 days?
Probably not. But there at least needs to be some kind of a start on those kind of negotiations. And there at least has to be some kind of negotiations, because at the moment, we're kind of at a standstill where the American administration is saying, well, we won't budge, and European officials are likewise saying we won't budge. So there, at least out of the G7, has to be some give that comes.
But are, in the end, tariffs really beneficial to the U.S. economy?
The thing is that actually, no. In my view, no. And it's a very interesting time also to begin to pursue such a policy. The jobs report, the U.S. jobs report, just came out last Friday, and it showed unemployment at 3.8%, which is the lowest that unemployment has been since 2000. So the American economy is actually in
a good place.
In a very good place.
Yes.
And these tariffs may well hurt key industries, the agricultural industry, key manufacturing industries. The thing is, we're also a little bit, it's too soon to tell, which is why you see the markets being quite optimistic in recent days.
Which is a point I was going to bring up. It's interesting, optimistic, almost unreactive, maybe.
Unreactive. Yeah. I think in some cases, maybe some of this is already priced into the markets to some extent. But I think it's also a little bit too soon to tell. So the markets are just going on as they have been. And especially on the back of the jobs report in the US, you see consumer confidence on the up. So investors in the markets are looking more towards those indicators, and I think are very much in a wait and see kind of period to see what will come of the tariffs. And what their actual impact will be. It might not be as severe as it seems at the moment. So we'll see what comes of it all, I suppose.
Yeah, and it seems like it's more, or is it? I ask you, is it more about just this geopolitical new order that's forming, and the markets are already somehow priced in there, as you said? I
think a little bit. I think that certainly some of the dynamic, especially, again, going back to the issue of China, and I think especially since Xi Jinping took power, and especially in more recent years, you see a China that, unlike in previous years, is much more willing and able, actually, to flex its muscles economically, politically, militarily, and to do that overseas. So part of the American standpoint or American position is a pushback against that, I think. Also, you see more aggression from China in the South China Sea and other powers in that region sort of rallying to push back. And now it's a question also of how Europe fits into that puzzle and how European powers cooperate. And so I think all of these shifts stem from a much larger, as you say, kind of changing geopolitical order, where suddenly you have more or less a multipolar global order.
Thank you so much for being with us, Aleksandra.
It's a pleasure.
Appreciate your insights.
Absolutely. Pleasure.